For as long as the Onion has existed, onion ranchers across the globe have been cataloging and tracking the movements of the onion Onision. Truly, this is a monument to humanity's sins, and it truly shows that we live in a society. Man, who knew I'd be back making a video on Onion Boy? Mainly because I have something to say, but also because it's the holidays, and I gotta profit off his craziness somehow, right? It's really just how the world works. Now, to be honest, we all know that Onision is a crazy person, right? I don't think anybody needs to be told any otherwise, right? And to be honest, I could make a video for 10 minutes just talking about all the recent crazy BS he's gotten up to. And I will touch on that a little bit, but I'm less concerned about that because, you know, there's a million videos out there like that already, and the smaller commentary channels, they gotta make their way up in the world. So please go ahead, I'm leaving that open for you to go handle. But no, I do actually have something to say regarding Onision, and moreover, specifically using the time Onision was trying to start a religion, Siseska, to have a conversation about cults and the cult of Onision. Anyway, let's get into the big think donks, but first, did you know it's the holidays, which means stuff's on sale. In particular, my merchandise. That's right, my merch is on sale. I dig the new designs quite a bit. You should go check them out. Go head over to the site, go pick yourself up a shirt and say, hey, I'm a quality individual who wears FPS Diesel merch. Because only the most quality individuals wear FPS Diesel merch. Anyway, Greg's cult. Well, I will say I'm not an expert on cults or on religion, but I have read a couple books in my day. In particular, this book, which will be the basis for our argument today, and will be the basis for a couple of future videos. Needless to say, it passed my mind after reading this book that, oh, remember that time Greg started a cult? Remember that time Onision had Siseska? And so, using this book, I will determine whether or not we avoided a David Koresh nightmare, or if this was just like a weird group of angsty vegans. Anyway, what makes this book a great book on cults? Well, it's done by Rick Ross. Not that Rick Ross, though that would be funny. It's done by this Rick Ross, who's a cult deprogrammer and expert on cults, who basically catalogs the entire history of cults in this book. They also go over the psychology and the understanding behind how these groups work, form, and operate. He specifically categorizes the cults in his books as destructive cults. You know all the famous ones. We got David Koresh and his Branch Davidians. We got, I mean, you know, just take your pick. You've seen a movie on it, then it's definitely a destructive cult. But basically, the research shows that destructive cults are basically made up of these three main components. One, a charismatic leader who increasingly becomes an object of worship as the general principles that may have originally sustained a group lose their power. Two, a process of coercive persuasion or thought reform. Three, economic, sexual, or other exploitation of group members by the leader and ruling group. And those three things are important because they're the three things that determine religions from cults, and also tell the difference between a group of people and a cult. And I should say, and they say so in the book, that cults aren't necessarily religious in nature. We actually need to separate this idea in our minds that cults are inherently religious, or they are religious groups, because cults can actually exist in multiple facets of unreligious groups. 2020 is only one example, but basically anywhere there's a demagogue, a cult of personality, a political group, hell, clubs, lifestyles like CrossFit, paleo, they use that as an example. And even just groups of friends can become cult-like in nature. Of course, as with all things and with dealing with human psychology, it exists on a spectrum, but generally we can use those three things to determine whether or not something is a destructive cult or not. Like, for example, I'd argue the cult of personality around Yandev is a destructive cult.
And you might be sitting here, Diesel, you just say charismatic, and Yandev don't necessarily go hand in hand.
And I agree, but let's be real here, we're looking at this from the outside in. Both you and I are not in the cult. Both you and I are not being manipulated by who he is, so he's not charismatic to us. I mean, hell, look at a guy like, I'll just use David Koresh and Charles Manson, because I know we all know who they are, right? Those guys aren't charismatic. We look at interviews and videos of Charles Manson, and you're like, oh, he's nuts. But you got to remember, we're not looking at it from the perspective of someone on the inside, right? We're looking at it as in, that's Charles Manson, he's insane. You know, but what makes Yandev's cult of personality a destructive group, right? What makes that happen? Well, the group does engage in thought reform. Let's see, oh, he economically abuses his followers by soliciting money online with a hierarchical structure using his Discord. And those who donate more get more attention from the ruling class, which is Yandev. And when you think about it in the perspective of someone from the inside, right, especially with Greg, of course, he's not charismatic, but he has a community that engages, and this community engages in those things like coercive persuasion and all the tactics talked about before. Needless to say, I don't even need to get into detail, but I know we all know that Greg has exploited fans in the past for a myriad of reasons, in some ways worse than others, but you know, I won't get into that because this video will be 1 billion years long. Now, when you look at a cult, they have a pseudo-religious hierarchy with an object of worship at the top, usually a living god. Supreme Master Ching Hai is a great example of this, as being the only living person able to have a direct contact with a god or supreme being, or being the only person who's enlightened. And it makes sense that this is something that happens in cults because a majority of the time, those who are leaders of cults are also, I mean, for lack of a better way to put this, they're usually just insane sociopaths. I think Jim Jones is a great example of this. I mean, he was responsible for the largest loss of life, of American civilian loss of life, before 9/11. And what makes him an object of worship? Well, he preached he was the only straight man, the only real straight man on earth, and that all the other men were lying. And then he has a whole number of other things that I can't even discuss in this video in detail. But I think we all know what Jonestown is, right? So when you look at how Jonestown operates and him being at the top as this object of worship, oh, you go to notice, oh yeah, that was really bad. And since Mr. Jim Jones said he was the only straight man on earth, of course that means he could have sex with whatever the women he wanted and tons of other awful, awful things. And Jonestown is a great example of mind control and thought reform. Really, I wouldn't even call it thought reform in this case, it's thought policing, which is definitely a buzzword these days, but this is the most deliberate example of it existing. Part of what makes Jonestown interesting is that they took a lot of the thought reform, thought policing, and mind control techniques from post-revolution China and North Korea. So, you know, he was really modeling it off of just great people. Now, I'm going to bring this back to Greg in a second, right? But people got on my case last time when I said this. And yes, okay, physical torture is bad, and that's bad, right? The point of torture is not just to punish the wrongdoer. The point is to make sure everyone stays in rank and file and follows societal rules when you got everyone on the same page. Torture also doesn't need to be physical. By the time a cult removes you from your old life and this new life becomes all you know, this new family and society can torture you with social pressures. Remember, it's about handling societal rules. I think one way we can see this way of social pressure torture work is by groups like Jehovah's Witness. And I would hear this argued that it's not a cult, but it does exhibit cult-like tendencies. And there are a couple of other religions that do this, so it's not just them. I'm just using them as an example. There's actually a YouTuber who was ex-Jehovah's Witness who's been completely shunned by his family, so I'll leave a link to his channel if you're interested to learn more about that. Anyway, Jehovah's Witness shun family who leave the religion. And not just the, you know, I'm not going to talk to you kind of thing, but I recognize your existence. I mean, a total you just don't exist anymore kind of deal. So, social pressure is going to ensure conformity. And when I did my canceling video, that's the point I was trying to get across there, but I guess I didn't lay it out as plainly. So I'm going to say it again. Social pressure ensures conformity. That's how canceling works. For some reason, people watched that video and thought that when I said whipping is equal to, like, you know, getting canceled, they thought I was saying they're equal literally, when I'm saying that the function of, you know, canceling and whipping is the same. Not that what is happening is identical. I'm saying that the societal function is the same. And research has shown how mental torture can be just as bad as physical, so, you know, whatever. All this is just gonna get completely off topic. What the fuck does this have to do with Greg? I mean, Greg is practically known for the social pressure he puts on his audience. He practically preaches it in all of his videos about how life should work. The merits of his lifestyle are something that are constantly brought up in ways that we use to explain how bad he is. You know, his ability of casting harsh judgment on those who don't follow his straight edge mentality towards life. You know, his shaming of those who don't follow his dietary preferences or lifestyle. Just, there's countless videos on him doing those things. This overall disposition towards life that Greg preaches to an audience, right, are what helps to build a backbone of a pseudo-religion, and they also help us define factors that separate him from a religion and allow us to say, oh, this is a cult. Now, he's not fully a cult yet, I'd argue. I'd say he needs to introduce a morality structure, which is where Suseska comes in. The morality structure that is separate and a part of a religion will allow social pressures to be enacted and coercive persuasion to be more convincing and convincing of people to join this cult. When a group like Suseska or some other cult says that they're doing it for the betterment of mankind, it's more or less for the betterment of control over a group. Now, let's look at Suseska specifically. All right, so now we've already tackled how thought reform, the second pillar, is related to Greg, and how Greg introduces that into his cult and also his current cult of personality around him and the teens that follow his every word and wish. But let's go back to one, because I think that's the one where people will lose me the most, because one is about a charismatic leader who becomes the object of worship, and we obviously know Greg not to be a charismatic person. Now, Rick Ross catalogs traits and personalities of cults ranging from 5 to 500 members, but generally, like I said earlier, all the leaders are basically madmen. I mean, for example, Vernon Howell, aka David Koresh of the Waco Siege and Branch Davidians. David Koresh claimed to have been getting direct visions from God since about 19, when he got a 15-year-old girl pregnant. I should mention that was legal at the time, by the way. He also said that after opening a Bible to Isaiah 34:16, he recited, "None should want for her mate," and as a result of reading this, he kept harassing the pastor, who was the father, I believe, that he must marry the girl at the behest of God, which is one way to convince the church of your baby mama, I guess. But basically, David Koresh would just receive visions directly from God. And he would use these visions and his ability to be a seer, basically, as excuses for him to abuse and take advantage of children, and specifically use words that rhyme with the word grape on young children. Now, I'm certain all of us who enjoy the spookiness online enjoy the videos of Marshall Applewhite as well, who's another very famous cult leader.
We'll title this tape, Planet Earth About to be Recycled. Your only chance to evacuate is to leave with us.
Again, Applewhite also received prophetic visions. He had direct contact with God, and I'm using God in like a very just a religious sense. I think here in the West we're associated with Christian God, but God is just a stand-in for any higher supreme being with omniscience. So I think Applewhite believed aliens. Please see Scientology's idea of the higher being. At first, I didn't know if Greg was receiving messages from God, but I could really just toss those tropes aside and say that that's not necessarily something you need. Oh, but another YouTuber had linked to a post where Greg did just that and received messages from God. And I will point out that both, it reads sarcastic, and the YouTuber Mental Health Master also said it sounds sarcastic, and I would agree with that. I would also say that this, like, need to be a direct contact with God isn't necessarily a required factor for a cult anyway, but it's part of how we can look at someone and try to determine what type of cult leader they are. I'll just say that Greg had that post, and that's it. Take it for it what you will. I don't think he's quite, a believer of a physical god. I don't think that's part of his personal philosophy. And when I use these comparisons with other famous cults, I'm not directly comparing Onision to that cult. The point of it is to give you a cultural reference point to understand and make connections between Onision's cult and other cults in the past. It's because of the historical writings and all those scientific papers that we have on these cults that we are able to build a profile of what a cult looks like. Now, I will say, though, that Greg, according to his books, which are totally not semi-biographies, but there's a mystical upbringing, which is very frequently mentioned with a lot of these groups. Another cult leader we covered, Ching Hai, also claims to have started her religion in her youth. Many cult leaders have said they have had prophetic visions at as young an age as 8. Future cult leader, I'm coming for you. Now, Greg, to an outsider, yeah, definitely comes off as how the academic community would put this, kind of a dick. However, again, we aren't the ones with this thought control over us, so we can look at it with more objective eyes than someone under it. Anybody can be taken in by a cult, right? There are factors that can make you more susceptible, but it's anybody. Smart people fall for cults just the same. So what makes someone follow the cult of Onision? What would make somebody want to pick up the religion of Seseska? What would make somebody a fan of Onision and want to engage in that cult community around him? All right, so how do you fall into the cult of Onision, all right? Well, I think we can put it like this, right? Let's try and wrap our heads around this. You're lost in the world. Hell, maybe you even got it all figured out, but you want more in life. Because you want more, you don't have it all figured out yet, and you're trying to find a place where you belong. That's how you can fall for a cult, an MLM, a get-rich-quick scheme. Any scam or soothsayer who could say something like that, this is who they're going to be able to convince more easily. How else could you fall into this? You're looking to feel a part of something, right? Or feeling successful at something. You want these things. We feel good when we get these things. So if there's something that's going to give us a method to achieving these things, we're going to be more inclined to follow it, even if it's not actually in our best interest. A major psychological component of religion is that it gives a sense of belonging. You have a clear sense of life after death, which is a huge existential sticking point for much of humanity. It brings order through a morality system, something that we look out to the world and we see chaos and we want that order. Now, I'm gonna make a hot take guess on what kind of audience Greg has. And I might be wrong, but I'm pretty confident in this, given that I just watched Morgis's last video on Onision, and it was really good, by the way. I'll link that below as well. After looking at that video, I think I could take a hot guess on who Onision's audience is. I'm gonna say that his audience falls into the teens, right? I think that's a pretty easy one to make. Late teens, high school, right? Right, maybe I'd say these are teens that are more or less outcast from their community that they're around. They're looking for a place to belong. Listen, I can only give a semi-accurate take on my own personal audience, but let's just say you're a goth girl in the middle of Nebraska and everyone at Sunday school looks at you kind of funny. I think you're gonna feel pretty outcast and that you're gonna be more inclined to seek out people that are like you online. Many of his videos, and I think that's deliberate from Greg's own personal psychoses, his videos are just based around life in high school, how you should feel about certain things happening here or there. And these videos would be sent to an audience that's at a time when they feel alone and they're looking for a sense of belonging. And here's this guy who's got it all figured out. He's got it all figured out, and he's got this way for you to be involved with more people that are not only like him, but are your age. Look, guys, I wasn't in high school that long ago when I truly think about it. I'm 22 now. High school was, what, 4 or 5 years ago for me? But if it wasn't for Onion Sand's awful personality, right? In high school, there were videos that he made on topics that I wanted to know more about. Luckily, there are people online that are not him, right? And it was enough information by the time I was in high school that it was not that much of a problem, you know. But I get that upbringing because I was like this new metal pop punk fat kid who wore black pants and flannels and these thick DC shoes with orange trim. Trust me, if I wasn't making poor friend choices in high school with the kids who like to smoke cigarettes outside the local pizzeria of my small town, then I don't know what I would have done to fill up my own personal pop punk band of kids who wanted to get out of their own little backwoods country village. Literally, I was the pop punk cliche. I don't know what to say, you know, and I know there's a lot of kids like that too. Hell, having renounced my own religion in high school and all that, Onision was out there speaking on topics like that. But we gotta understand that this community that is people of that ilk, right? There's this community that's grown up around him, and I think it is a toxic one, I will say that. I believe it is toxic, and I believe it is based around the worship of a man who is shit, right? But let's say you speak out against your group, and you're in that in-group. The social pressure would say that you either capitulate to believing whatever a more ruling member of the group says, is like, oh no, those are people that are against Onision. Onision is a black sheep. He is telling the truth, and you'll shut up, or you'll be shunned from the community, right? And now you've gone from a place where you don't have any friends, and now you're in this in-group, this cult of personality around Onision, where you have friends, right? And one of the only requirements to be friends and in this community is worship Onision. They'd be less inclined to leave the group because, well, a teen with no friends, well, that sucks. Teens don't want to have no friends. I don't think it's a surprise that a lot of teens, especially now, and people growing up in a primarily online-based society, are falling prey to toxic online communities. It's almost like when we ostracize people from our community, they seek out unhealthy relationships. Oh my God, Guys, I figured it out. I figured out the political divide in society. So it's really easy to point fingers at the groupies around Onision and say, look at all this, just reams and reams of information on Onision. He's bad, right? But we got to think about it less of what Onision actually is and more of what he becomes for the people that are in these groups. The point is, the social proof around them says Onision good, outside bad, us versus them mentality. Which, you know, also ties it back to the thought reform we talked about earlier. The third pillar, which is, you know, based around the exploitation of members, right, is really, you know, how we look at the creator-fan relationship online, and also a bit more of a pay-to-play system to become a member of Onision's inner circle. Now, looking at the Wayback Machine, Seseska doesn't really seem to have any donations. If they do, the website, I mean, it looks like garbage, so it's kind of hard to just look at anyway, but you don't even need to donate to Seseska because you can donate to Onision by giving your time, your money to buy his merch, to buy his garbage, to support him on whatever site he's on now. I think economic exploitation is the biggest feature of successful cults in modern age. There's a bit of a sunk cost there. You're not gonna go. Tons of religions solicit donations from members of the church. It's out there. I mean, just look at Scientology. It is literally, the more you pay, the more you learn about the group. So think about it this way. The more you pay to Onision, the more you get to learn about Onision. The point I'm getting at here is that Seseska is merely an arm of what the actual cult is, the cult of Onision. Seseska, would it have been a cult if it had come to fruition? Probably. But the cult's already there. It's the cult of Onision. Seseska only puts Onision and his self in a religious context, because outside of that, we again tend to think of cults as not being a-religious. Being a-religious, there we go. Seseska only grants the words he's spewing religious context. But you know, outside of what we have, all of these things are just vague enough to just be like his opinion man. I mean, even when you read Seseska's website, it's more like reading the personal philosophical musings of Onision. You know, like, oh, he's always had the perception of being of the earth kind of deal. You know, what's another thing? Greg doesn't like the role of religion in government. What a surprise that's also a pillar of his religion, to not be involved in political matters. You get the point here, right? What I would call a personal philosophy, he is packaged and marketed as a religion. And he changed it to a religion because in Greg's mind, The way Greg thinks is the best for everybody. So if everybody thought like Greg, we'd just have a better world. Which, could you imagine if we just had thousands and thousands of Onisions running around? Oh my God. Those who have paid into supporting Onision in any sense of the word, right, have a sunk cost, and they feel a higher level of devotion to him for the money that they've given into it. This is economic exploitation in this case, because they don't want that separation of fan and creator. They want to be one in a huge group. There are other ways that I know Onision has exploited people and inner sanctum fans and friends. That's out there. Those videos have been done to death before. I know we all know. Really, the exploitation of the idea of getting to know Onision is really similar to the same way that Yandev exploits the want for people to get this weird yandere simulator game, and he exploits the cash from their wallets. Onision presents a cult of personality for people to jockey the use of money to spend time around. Anyone who deviates from the rules that Onision sets up in his own community, from his personal philosophy, will be shunned and punished, possibly by himself, as we've seen from his Twitch streams where he just rips a teenager a new butthole. Seseska is a cult because Onision is a cult. They are one and the same thing. There's not really a separation between it, and the idea that there is a separation between them is kind of funny to me, because I do look at Onision's community and say, that's a cult. Really, we can only see how these are one and the same when we look at his vegan lifestyle, his body standards and practices of women and men, and hell, even to his fetishes and what he deems sexually arousing, which there's then definitely some of those videos online. Eesh. Really, a big part of what makes Onision's family a cult is its own hierarchy, rules, and us versus them mentality. This is why I always preach the idea that you need to be able to have separation between creators and fans, because I do think there is a bit of a growing trend where people develop idolization around people online that they kind of worship as idols rather than people. It's why I fight against stan culture, because I think it is a means to dangerous things in the future, right? I think it could very much turn into something much more toxic, and that it would not help people who have issues that they need to work out. You can find links to all my sources down below. Sorry, this has been a ridiculously long video. I hope you all appreciate it anyway. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and be safe. Don't lick, I don't know, toilet seats or wherever coronavirus comes from now.